You're on a canoe made of two hollowed-out logs, lashed together with rope. No metal, no nails, no compass, no radio. Just you, a handful of people you trust with your life, and the open Pacific Ocean stretching in every direction, all the way to a horizon that never changes, no matter how long you stare at it. The sun sets, the stars come out, and somewhere out there, thousands of miles away, is an island you've never seen. You have no map of it, no coordinates, no satellite image, just stories passed down from people who found it before you. So how do you get there? How do you cross an ocean bigger than every continent combined, with nothing but a wooden canoe and your own senses, and actually land exactly where you meant to? Let's start with the scale of what we're talking about, because it's almost hard to comprehend. The Pacific Ocean covers about 63 million square miles. It's larger than all the land masses on Earth combined, and scattered across it are thousands of islands, many of them separated by open water for hundreds or even thousands of miles. Around 3,000 years ago, a group called the Lapita people began pushing east from the Bismarck Archipelago near New Guinea into the open Pacific. We know this migration happened because of a very specific kind of pottery. Dentate stamped ceramics with distinctive geometric patterns, found buried in a trail of sites stretching from the Solomon Islands all the way out to Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. Archaeologists can literally trace the spread of this pottery style island by island, and use it to date how fast people were moving across open water, most of them capable of crossing hundreds of miles between one landfall and the next. Over the following centuries, the descendants of these voyagers, the ancestors of modern Polynesians, pushed further and further outward, deeper into open ocean where island stepping stones became rarer and the crossings became longer. By roughly 1000 CE, humans had settled Hawaii in the north, Easter Island far to the southeast, and New Zealand to the south, 3 points that form what's often called the Polynesian Triangle, spanning about 10 million square miles of open ocean. To put that in perspective, that's like starting in New York and successfully sailing without instruments to a specific tiny island somewhere near the coast of Africa, and getting it right on the first try, not once, but repeatedly, across generations, in both directions. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't people getting lucky and drifting somewhere. Drifting doesn't explain return voyages, and it doesn't explain canoes loaded deliberately with crops, animals, and enough people to start a new settlement. This was navigation, a full, working system, refined over centuries, that let people deliberately sail toward islands they had never seen, based purely on memory, observation, and pattern recognition. The first layer of that system was the sky. Polynesian navigators used something called a star compass. Instead of the 4 directions you're used to, north, south, east, west, they divided the horizon into as many as 32 points, each one tied to where a specific star rose or set on the horizon. A navigator memorized the rising and setting points of dozens of stars across the sky, essentially building a mental clock and compass combined into one. As one star climbed too high overhead to track its bearing accurately, another star would be rising at a known point to take its place, creating a continuous, unbroken chain of reference points that lasted through the entire night. This is not casual knowledge. Master navigators in this tradition, sometimes called wayfinders, spent decades training, often starting as young children, memorizing entire star paths tied to specific ocean routes between specific islands, so that a single voyage might require knowledge of dozens of stars in sequence. In the 20th century, a Micronesian navigator named Mau Piailug became one of the last people alive who still held this complete traditional knowledge, learned from his grandfather on the tiny island of Satawal. In 1976, without any modern instruments on board, he successfully navigated a double-hulled canoe called the Hokulea over 2,000 miles from Hawaii to Tahiti, using only the stars, the sun, the swells, and the behavior of the ocean itself to hold his course. Scientists and historians at the time had genuinely assumed this kind of precision navigation might have been exaggerated, or that ancient Pacific settlement had happened mostly by lucky, accidental drift. Piailug's voyage put traditional, non-instrument wayfinding to a real test on the open ocean, and it proved the method wasn't guesswork. It was accurate enough to hold a course across open water for weeks and still hit a specific target island. But stars only help you if the sky is clear, and the Pacific isn't always clear. Storms roll in, cloud cover can last for days, and a navigator who only knew the stars would be lost the moment the sky closed up. So there was a second layer to this system, one that worked even through total cloud cover: the ocean itself. Long before a canoe physically reaches an island, that island changes the way ocean swells move around it. Islands block, bend, and reflect large ocean swells, creating secondary patterns of interference that ripple outward for tens, sometimes over 100 miles from the actual coastline. A trained navigator could lie down flat in the bottom of the canoe's hull and feel these patterns directly through the wood, distinguishing the steady, deep background swell rolling in from the open ocean from the subtler crossing wave patterns bouncing off land somewhere still completely invisible beyond the horizon. In the Marshall Islands, this knowledge became so refined that navigators built physical teaching tools called stick charts, lattices of curved palm ribs lashed together with small shells marking island positions, representing the swell and refraction patterns around specific island groups. These weren't charts you carried on the boat to check mid-voyage. They were teaching and memorization tools, studied intensively on land for years until the wave patterns were fully internalized. Once at sea, the chart wasn't in your hands anymore. It was in your body, read through the hull with your back and stomach pressed against the wood. The third layer was the sky again, but in a completely different way: clouds and birds. Islands, especially ones with lagoons, were traditionally read as casting a distinct greenish tint onto the underside of clouds above them, a cue navigators learned to associate with shallow lagoon water long before the island itself ever broke the horizon. Certain cloud formations were also known to build up and sit stationary over islands, since land and ocean heat the air above them differently, giving wayfinders a marker in the sky long before land was close enough to see with the naked eye. And then there were the birds. Certain seabirds, like frigate birds, boobies, and terns, roost on land every night but fly out over open water to fish during the day, sometimes 30 miles or more from shore. A navigator who spotted these birds flying outward and away in the early morning knew land was somewhere behind them in that direction. One spotted flying purposefully toward a fixed point in the evening was heading home to roost, and following that direction at dusk could lead a canoe toward an island that was still completely invisible over the horizon. None of this would matter without the fourth layer, the boats themselves. These weren't simple rafts or dugout canoes paddled by hand. Polynesian voyaging canoes, especially the double-hulled kind, represented genuinely sophisticated engineering. Two long hulls carved from single tree trunks, connected by a central platform, with sails woven from pandanus leaf fiber and rigging made entirely from braided plant fiber rope. There were no metal fasteners anywhere in the entire structure. The lashings connecting the hulls to the platform had to be strong enough to survive weeks of pounding in rough, open water, and flexible enough to actually flex with the movement of the hulls independently instead of snapping under the strain. A design refined over countless generations of trial, failure, and rebuilding. These canoes weren't just fast, they were built to carry an entire founding population's worth of supplies: food crops like taro and breadfruit cuttings, live animals such as pigs and chickens, fresh water stored in hollowed gourds, and enough people to plant a new self-sustaining community the moment they made landfall, assuming the voyage succeeded at all. And that's really the key to all of this. None of these four layers, the stars, the swells, the clouds, and birds, the boats, worked in isolation. They worked because they were combined into a single continuous system, cross-checked constantly against each other throughout the voyage. If the sky clouded over for days, the swells still told you you're heading through the hull. If the swells got confusing near converging currents or storms, the stars at night corrected your course the moment they reappeared. If you were still unsure of your position, the birds at dawn and dusk gave you a second, independent opinion pointing toward land. A wayfinder wasn't relying on one method and simply hoping for the best. They were running multiple independent systems in parallel and constantly reconciling them. In much the same way a modern pilot cross-references several separate instruments instead of trusting just one and hoping it's correct. And this entire system was passed down almost entirely through oral tradition and years of lived apprenticeship, not written manuals or recorded charts. A master navigator would take on students young, sometimes as children barely old enough to swim, and train them for 15 or 20 years before they were ever trusted to navigate a real voyage alone. They memorized star paths tied to specific routes between specific named islands. They practiced feeling wave patterns during short training voyages close to home, long before ever attempting a genuine open ocean crossing where a mistake meant death. Knowledge this precise, capable of hitting a single small island after weeks and thousands of miles of open water, existed only in human memory, refined and corrected generation after generation. And it worked well enough to deliberately settle an area of the planet larger than most continents combined. By the time European explorers began crossing the Pacific centuries later with magnetic compasses, printed charts, and metal instruments, they were repeatedly astonished to find tiny, remote islands thousands of miles from anywhere already inhabited by people who had arrived there long before with none of those tools at all. For a long time, some historians assumed this settlement must have happened purely by accident. Canoes accidentally blown off course by storms and drifting helplessly until they happened to wash up on land. But experimental voyages like the Hokulea's 1976 crossing, along with decades of careful anthropological research into surviving traditional wayfinding knowledge in Micronesia and Polynesia, have made it increasingly clear that this was not luck. It was expertise, developed and perfected over dozens of generations, and coded not in books or on paper, but entirely in people willing to spend their whole lives learning to read a world most of us have simply stopped looking at. Right now, you're carrying a device in your pocket that can tell you your exact location on Earth to within a few feet, using satellites orbiting hundreds of miles above the planet. It can guide you door to door across an entire continent without you ever making a single wrong turn, recalculating instantly the moment you make a mistake. And it quietly makes the achievement of the wayfinders almost invisible, easy to overlook entirely, when in reality, it might be one of the most impressive feats of sustained human observation and memory that has ever existed. No satellites, no metal instruments, no written charts on board, no backup GPS if the sky clouded over for a week straight. Just centuries of watching the sky, feeling the ocean, reading birds and clouds, and passing all of that knowledge down through people who trusted their teachers with their lives, and then became the teachers themselves.